The Case of the Murder on D Hill. By Edogawa Rampo. Part 1, Facts. It was a close, sultry evening early in September. I was sipping iced coffee at Honkaku Bacon, a café I frequented halfway along the main road on D Hill. At the time I had only just left school and had no occupation to speak of. My daily routine consisted of lying about my lodging house reading, then, when I tired of that, wandering aimlessly through the streets and making the rounds of cafes that cost very little. Honkaku Bacon was near my lodgings and stood on a route I was bound to pass whenever I went for a walk, so naturally I visited it more often than any other. I have a bad habit, however, once I enter a cafe, I linger. I have never had much appetite, and my purse was usually thin besides, so instead of ordering even a single plate of Western food, I would sit there for an hour or two, ordering 2 or 3 refills of cheap coffee. This was not because I had designs on the waitresses or wished to tease them. The place was simply brighter and more comfortable than my lodgings. That evening, as usual, I had taken my customary table by the street and was spending a full 10 minutes over 1 glass of iced coffee while gazing absently out of the window. In those days D Hill, where Honkaku Bacon stood, was much quieter than it is now. The district had once been famous for its chrysanthemum figures, and the old narrow road had only recently been widened under a municipal improvement scheme into a broad avenue. Vacant lots still interrupted both sides of it. Directly opposite Honkaku Bacon, across the avenue, stood a second-hand bookshop. I had been watching its storefront for some time. It was a shabby little shop in an outlying neighborhood, hardly a sight worth contemplating, but it held a special interest for me. I had lately become acquainted at Honkaku Bacon with a peculiar man named Kogoro Akechi. Conversation soon revealed him to be eccentric, decidedly intelligent, and, to my great delight, an enthusiast for detective fiction. On an earlier occasion he had told me that a girl he had known in childhood was now the bookseller's wife. I remembered her from buying books there 2 or 3 times. She was strikingly beautiful, and though I could not have said precisely why, she possessed a sensual quality that drew men to her. Since she always minded the shop at night, I assumed she must be there that evening. I searched the whole establishment with my eyes, though its frontage was no more than about 15 feet wide, but saw no one. Expecting her to appear sooner or later, I continued to wait and watch. But the wife did not appear. I was growing tired of the matter and was about to turn my attention to the watchmaker next door when I saw the lattice panel in the shoji between the shop and the back room snap shut. Specialists call that kind of shoji a muso. The central part, where paper would ordinarily be pasted, consists of 2 layers of fine vertical latticework that can be opened and closed. How odd, I thought. Second-hand bookshops are vulnerable to shoplifting. Even when no one is sitting out front, somebody is normally in the back, keeping watch through the openings in the shoji. Why close the very place through which one could look? It might have made sense in cold weather, but this was a stifling evening at the beginning of September, and it was strange enough that the shoji itself had been closed. The more I considered it, the more I felt that something must be happening in the room behind the shop, and I could no longer bring myself to look away. The thought of the bookseller's wife brought back a curious piece of gossip I had once overheard among the cafe waitresses. They had apparently been comparing notes on the wives and daughters they met at the public bath. The bookseller's wife is so pretty, one said, but when she is naked her whole body is covered with marks. They must have been left by blows and pinches. It's strange, because she and her husband don't seem to get along badly. Another replied, the wife at Asahiya, the noodle shop along the same row, is often bruised too. Those marks look like beatings as well. I had paid little attention to what the gossip might mean, assuming only that the husbands treated them cruelly. But, dear reader, that was not the truth at all. Trivial as the matter seemed, I later learned that it bore heavily upon the entire story. In any event, I kept staring at the same place for nearly half an hour. Call it a premonition if you like, but I felt that something would happen the instant I glanced aside, and I could not turn my eyes away. Just then Kogoro Akechi, whom I mentioned a moment ago, passed the window in his usual yukata with its bold, broad vertical stripes, walking with that peculiar swing of the shoulders that was characteristic of him. He noticed me, bowed, and came inside. After ordering an iced coffee, he sat beside me, facing the window as I did. When he saw that I was staring at one particular spot, he followed my line of sight to the bookshop across the street. Strangely enough, he too appeared fascinated. He fixed his eyes on it and did not look away. Thus, as though by prior agreement, we watched the same place while exchanging idle remarks. I have forgotten the exact subjects we discussed, and they have little bearing on this story, but I know that we spoke of crime and detection. One sample of our conversation will suffice.
Do you think a crime that can never be discovered is impossible? Akechi asked. I believe there are many possibilities. Take Junichiro Tanizaki's Along the Road, for example. In reality, a crime of that kind would almost certainly go undiscovered. A detective does uncover it in the story, of course, but that is a creation of the author's marvelous imagination.
No, I disagree, I replied. Quite apart from what happens in practice, in theory there is no crime that cannot be detected. The only trouble is that our present police force has no detective as great as the one in Along the Road. That was the general tenor of our talk. Then, at a certain moment, we both fell silent as if on cue. Something intriguing had begun to happen at the bookshop opposite, which neither of us had ceased watching even while we talked. You have noticed it too, I see. I whispered, and he answered at once.
Book thieves, I suppose. But it is certainly strange. I have been watching since I came in. That makes the fourth one.
You have not been here half an hour, and 4 people in 30 minutes is rather suspicious. I had been watching before you arrived. About an hour ago, I saw the lattice panel of that shoji close. I have kept an eye on it ever since.
Could someone from the house have gone out?
But that shoji never opened. They might have left by the back door, but it is certainly odd for the place to remain unattended for half an hour. What do you say? Shall we go and look?
Yes. Even if nothing is wrong inside, something may have happened outside.
I left the café secretly hoping that this would prove to be a criminal case. Akechi must have felt the same, he too was plainly excited. The bookshop was of a common type. The entire shop had an earthen floor, with shelves rising to the ceiling along the front and both side walls. At waist height, the shelving projected into counters on which books were displayed. A long rectangular stand, also used for displaying and stacking books, stood like an island in the middle of the floor. At the right end of the shelves facing us was an opening about 3 feet wide that led to the back room, where the single shoji I mentioned earlier stood. Ordinarily either the proprietor or his wife sat watch on a half-mat patch of tatami in front of it. Akechi and I went as far as that patch of tatami and called loudly, but no one answered. The house truly seemed deserted. I slid the shoji open a little and peered into the back room. The electric light was out and the room was completely dark, but something resembling a human figure appeared to be lying in one corner. Alarmed, I called again. There was no response.
Never mind the formality. Let us go in.
We clattered into the back room. Akechi flipped the light switch. The instant the room brightened, we both cried out. In one corner lay the body of a woman. It is the bookseller's wife, I finally managed to say. Doesn't it look as if she was strangled?
Akechi went closer and examined the body. There is no hope of reviving her. We must notify the police at once. I'll run to the public telephone. You stay here and guard the place. We had better not tell the neighbors yet, they might destroy the clues.
With these instructions, he dashed to a public telephone about half a block away. I had always been capable of holding forth impressively on crime and detection, but this was the first real case I had ever encountered. I had no idea what to do. All I could manage was to stare fixedly about the room. It was a single six-mat room. At the rear, the right-hand section, one ken, about 6 feet wide, opened across a narrow veranda onto a garden of about 8 square yards and a privy, beyond which stood a board fence. Since it was summer, everything was open and plainly visible. On the left, in a section half a ken, about 3 feet wide, a hinged door led to a wooden-floored space of about 2 mats. Beyond it, beside the back entrance, was a narrow washing area whose waist-high shoji was closed. Along the wall to our right, foreclosed fusuma apparently concealed the stairs to the second floor and a storage space. It was the most ordinary arrangement imaginable in a cheap row house. The body lay near the left-hand wall with its head toward the shop. Partly because I wished not to disturb the scene of the crime, and partly because the sight repelled me, I kept away from it. Yet the room was so small that my eyes returned to it however much I tried not to look. The woman wore a yukata with a bold, medium-scale pattern and lay almost on her back. Her robe had been pushed up above her knees, exposing her thighs, but there were no other signs of a struggle. I could not see her neck clearly, though what appeared to be marks of strangulation had turned purple. Traffic continued along the avenue outside. People passed in loud conversation, their wooden clogs clattering. A drunk went by bellowing a popular song. Outside, the world went peacefully on, while just one thin shoji away a woman lay brutally murdered. The irony of it made me strangely sentimental, and I stood there in a daze.
They say they will come at once.
Akechi returned, out of breath. Oh. I see. Even speaking had somehow become an effort. For a long time the two of us stared at each other without a word. Before long a uniformed officer arrived with a man in Western clothes. I learned afterward that the uniformed man was the chief investigating officer at K police station. The other, as his appearance and equipment suggested, was the police physician attached to the same station. We gave the chief investigating officer a general account of everything from the beginning, to which I added the following. I happened to look at the clock when Akechi entered the café. It was about 8:30, so I believe the lattice panel of that shoji closed at roughly 8 o'clock. I am certain the light in this room was on then. Therefore, at least one living person was clearly here at about 8. While the chief investigating officer took down our statements in his notebook, the police physician completed a preliminary examination of the body. He waited until we had finished speaking, then said,
Strangulation. Done by hand. Look here. These purple marks were made by the fingers, and the bleeding occurred where the nails dug in. The thumb mark is on the right side of the neck, so the killer used the right hand. Yes, I should say she has been dead no more than an hour. There is, of course, no possibility of resuscitation. He pinned her down from above, the chief investigating officer said thoughtfully. Yet there is no sign that she resisted. It must have been done very suddenly and with tremendous force.
He turned to us and asked where the master of the house had gone. Naturally, we did not know. Akechi therefore had the presence of mind to summon the watchmaker from next door. The exchange between the chief investigating officer and the watchmaker went more or less as follows.
Where has the proprietor gone?
The master here sets up a second-hand bookstall every night, sir. He never returns before about midnight.
Where does he set up his stall?
He often goes to Hirakoji in Ueno, sir, but I could not say where he went tonight.
Did you hear any noise about an hour ago?
What sort of noise, sir?
Isn't it obvious? A scream when this woman was killed, the sound of a struggle, anything of that kind.
I do not believe I heard anything in particular, sir.
Meanwhile, neighbors who had heard the news and curious passers-by filled the front of the bookshop. Among them was the woman from the other neighboring shop, a tabi shop selling traditional split-toe socks. She supported the watchmaker's statement. She too declared that she had heard no noise. During this time, the neighbors apparently conferred and sent a messenger to find the bookseller. An automobile stopped outside, and several men came bustling in. They were officials from the court who had hurried over after receiving the urgent report, together with the chief of K police station and a detective named Kobayashi, who was then widely reputed to be a master of his profession. I learned these details only later. A friend of mine was a newspaper court correspondent and happened to be very close to Detective Kobayashi, who was assigned to this case, so afterward I heard a great deal from him. The chief investigating officer who had arrived first explained all that had occurred. We too were required to repeat our statements.
Let us close the front doors.
A man in a black alpaca jacket and white trousers, looking rather like a low-ranking office employee, suddenly shouted this and began briskly closing them. This was Detective Kobayashi. Having driven away the sightseers, he set to work. His manner was utterly high-handed. He behaved as though neither prosecutor nor police chief existed. From beginning to end, he alone was active. Everyone else seemed no more than a spectator who had come to watch him dart efficiently about. First he examined the body, paying particular attention to the neck.
There is nothing distinctive about these finger marks, he told the prosecutor. They reveal no more than that an ordinary person pinned her down with the right hand.
Next he proposed stripping the body for examination. Like members of the public excluded from a secret session of Japan's Diet, we onlookers had to withdraw into the shop. I therefore do not know precisely what was discovered, but they must have noticed the many fresh injuries on the dead woman's body, the very ones the café waitresses had discussed. When this secret session ended, we refrained from re-entering the back room and watched instead from the strip of tatami at the boundary between it and the shop. Fortunately, because we had discovered the crime and because Akechi's fingerprints would later have to be taken, we were not expelled altogether. It might be more accurate to say we were detained. Detective Kobayashi's activity, however, extended far beyond the back room, both inside and outside the house, so from one fixed position we could not possibly follow his investigation. By good fortune the prosecutor established himself in the back room and scarcely moved. Each time the detective went out or returned, he reported every result, and we were able to overhear it all. On the basis of those reports, the prosecutor dictated material for the official record to his clerk. The back room where the body lay was searched first. There appeared to be no abandoned article, footprint, or anything else to catch a detective's eye, with one exception.
There are fingerprints on the light switch, said the detective, who had dusted the black ebonite switch with white powder. From the circumstances, the killer must have turned the light off. But which of you turned it on?
Akechi answered that he had.
I see. We shall take your fingerprints later. No one is to touch this switch. We will remove it as it stands and take it with us.
The detective then went upstairs and remained there for some time. As soon as he came down, he announced that he would examine the alley and went outside. Perhaps 10 minutes passed before he returned, with his flashlight still on and accompanied by a man of about 40, a grimy fellow in a dirty crepe shirt and khaki trousers.
The footprints are useless, the detective reported. The ground around the back entrance gets little sun and is a complete quagmire. It is so covered with random clawed marks that nothing can be made of them. As for this man, he indicated the fellow he had brought in. He sells ice cream at the corner where the rear alley opens onto the street. If the killer escaped through the back door, he would have had to use that alley, which is only one outlet, and this man could hardly have failed to see him. Now, answer my questions once more.
The detective then questioned the ice cream seller.
Did anyone enter or leave this alley at around 8 this evening?
Not a soul. Since nightfall, not even a cat has passed through, the ice cream seller answered readily. I have kept my stall here for a long time. Even the women who live in this row hardly ever use that alley at night. The footing is poor, you see, and it is pitch dark.
Did any of your customers go into the alley?
None of them. Every customer ate his ice cream in front of me and went straight back the way he had come. There is no mistake about it.
If the ice cream seller's testimony was trustworthy, then even if the murderer had fled through the back door, he had not left by the alley, the only route leading from it. Nor could he have gone out through the front, since we had watched it from Haku-bacon. What, then, had become of him? Detective Kobayashi believed that the culprit must either be hiding in one of the row houses lining the two sides of the alley, or be one of the tenants himself. It was true that someone might have escaped from the second floor across the roofs. Yet the front upstairs window had a fixed lattice that showed no sign of disturbance, and in that heat all the rear windows stood open. Some residents were even cooling themselves on the rooftop platforms used for drying laundry. Escape that way seemed difficult. The investigators briefly conferred about their next course. They finally divided into groups and searched every neighboring house. There were only 11 dwellings in the 2 rows, so the work was not especially burdensome. At the same time, the bookshop itself was searched again from beneath the floor to the roof space. The effort yielded nothing and, indeed, seemed only to make the problem more difficult. The confectioner who lived one house beyond the bookshop had been sitting on his rooftop drying platform playing the shakuhachi, a Japanese bamboo flute, from dusk until just before the search. Throughout that period, he occupied a position from which he could hardly have missed anything that happened at the bookshop's upstairs window. Dear reader, the case was becoming fascinating. Where had the killer entered, and where had he escaped? Not by the back door, not by the upstairs window, and of course not through the front. Had he never existed in the first place, or had he vanished like smoke? Nor was that the only mystery. 2 students brought before the prosecutor by Detective Kobayashi made extraordinarily curious statements. They lodged in the rear row of houses and attended an industrial school. Neither appeared the sort to invent nonsense, yet their testimony made the case still more incomprehensible. In reply to the prosecutor's questions, they gave substantially the following answers.
At about 8 this evening, I was standing in front of the bookshop, leafing through a magazine on the display stand. I heard some sort of noise in the back, so I looked up at the shoji. The shoji itself was closed, but its lattice panel was open, and through the gap I saw a man standing there. I raised my eyes at almost the same instant he closed the lattice, so naturally I could not see him in detail. But from the way his sash was tied, I am certain it was a man.
Apart from the fact that he was a man, did you notice anything, his height and build, or the pattern of his clothes?
I saw him only from the waist down, so I cannot say much about his build. His clothes were black. They may possibly have had fine stripes or a mottled woven pattern, but to my eyes they looked plain black. I was looking at books with my friend, said the other student, and I too heard the noise and saw the lattice close, but the man was definitely wearing white, pure white, without stripes or any other pattern.
That is rather strange, is it not? One of you must be mistaken.
I am not mistaken. Nor am I lying.
What did the student's strange testimony mean? An astute reader has probably noticed one possibility. I too noticed it. The officials from the court and the police, however, did not seem to give the point much thought.
Before long, the dead woman's husband returned after receiving the news. He was a slight, young man who did not look like a second-hand bookseller. When he saw his wife's body, his timid nature revealed itself. Though he made no sound, tears streamed down his face. Detective Kobayashi waited for him to recover before questioning him, with the prosecutor occasionally adding a question. To their disappointment, the husband could suggest no possible culprit. She was not a woman who would earn anyone's hatred, he said through his tears. His examination of the premises also established that robbery had not been the motive. The investigators inquired into his past, his wife's origins, and many other matters. Nothing aroused suspicion or greatly concerned this narrative, so I shall omit them. Finally, the detective asked about the many fresh injuries on the dead woman's body. The husband hesitated for a long moment but at last admitted that he had caused them. Despite persistent questioning, however, he gave no clear explanation of why. Since it was known that he had been at his night stall throughout the evening, even injuries caused by abuse could not implicate him in the murder. The detective may have thought the same, for he did not pursue the matter.
The examination was then suspended for the night. Our names and addresses were recorded, Akechi's fingerprints were taken, and it was after 1 in the morning when we finally started home. If the police search had overlooked nothing and the witnesses had told the truth, the case was indeed inexplicable. As I learned later, all Detective Kobayashi's subsequent inquiries, beginning the next day, were equally fruitless. The case remained exactly where it had stood on the night of the murder. Every witness was considered reliable. Nothing suspicious was found among the residents of the 11-row houses. The victim's hometown was investigated, with equally uneventful results. So far as Detective Kobayashi, a man reputed, as I have said, to be a master detective, could determine after exerting his full ability, the crime remained wholly incomprehensible. I later learned one further detail. The light switch that he had taken away as his sole piece of physical evidence yielded, to his dismay, no print except Akechi's. Perhaps because Akechi had been flustered, he had left many impressions, but every one was his own. The detective concluded that Akechi's prints had probably obliterated the murderers. Dear reader, does this account call to mind Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue or Doyle's The Speckled Band? Have you imagined that the murderer was not human at all, but some creature such as an orangutan or a venomous snake from India? I confess that I considered the same idea. Yet an animal of either kind was hardly likely to be roaming D Hill in Tokyo, and witnesses had seen the figure of a man through the shoji lattice. An ape would have left footprints and attracted notice, while the finger marks on the woman's neck were unmistakably human. No coiling snake could have left marks of that kind. In any event, Akechi and I discussed the case with great excitement as we walked home that night. The following gives some idea of our talk.
You know the Rose Delacourt case in Paris, Akechi said, the one that supplied material for Poe's Rue Morgue and Leroux's The Yellow Room? More than a century has passed, yet that strange murder remains unsolved. Tonight's crime reminded me of it. In both cases, the murderer left no trace of his departure.
Yes, it is truly extraordinary. People often say that the construction of Japanese houses makes the serious crimes found in foreign detective stories impossible here. I do not agree at all. Here we have just such a case before us. I do not know whether I am capable of it, but I feel tempted to investigate this one myself. We parted at a side street. I remember Akechi turning the corner and hurrying home with his characteristic rolling gait, the bold stripes of his yukata standing out sharply in the darkness. Part 2. Reasoning. About 10 days after the murder, I visited Kogoro Akechi's lodgings. What had Akechi and I done, considered, and concluded about the case during those 10 days? The reader will be able to infer it fully from the conversation we had that day. Until then I had met Akechi only at the café, and this was my first visit to his lodgings. He had told me the address, however, and I found it without difficulty. I stopped before a tobacconist's shop that appeared to be the place and asked the proprietor's wife whether Akechi was at home. "Yes, he is. Please wait a moment while I call him." She went from the shop front to the foot of the stairs, which was visible from where I stood, and called Akechi loudly. He rented a room on the 2nd floor.
"Yes?" After giving this oddly drawn-out answer, Akechi came creaking down the stairs. When he saw me, he looked surprised. "Ah, come up," he said. I followed him to the 2nd floor. The moment I casually stepped into his room, I stopped in astonishment. Its appearance was so extraordinary that, although I knew he was eccentric, even I found it excessive.
The 4.5-mat room was simply buried in books. Only a little tatami remained visible at the center, everywhere else rose piles of volumes. Along all 4 walls and the fusuma, they spread across almost the entire floor at the bottom and narrowed as they climbed, forming embankments that pressed inward from every side nearly to the ceiling. There was no other furniture. I wondered how he could possibly sleep there. There was not even room for host and guest to sit. One careless movement might bring a landslide of books down to crush us.
"I am sorry it is so cramped. I have no cushions either. Please sit on a pile that looks reasonably soft."
I forced my way among the mounds and at last found a place to sit, but for some time I could only stare blankly around me. At this point I should say something about Kogoro Akechi, the owner of this remarkable room. Our acquaintance was recent, so I knew nothing of his background, how he supported himself, or what purpose he pursued in life. One thing was certain, he had no settled occupation and belonged to that class of cultivated idlers. Perhaps one might have called him a student, though he was a highly unusual one. Once he told me, "I study human beings." I did not then understand what he meant. All I knew was that he possessed an exceptional interest in crime and detection, together with a formidable wealth of knowledge. He was about my own age and could not have been over 25. He was rather thin and, as I have said, swung his shoulders oddly when he walked. It was not the swagger of a heroic figure. To make a peculiar comparison, his gait recalled Hakuru Kanda, the storyteller with the disabled arm. Indeed, from his features to his voice, Akechi closely resembled Hakuru. Readers who have never seen the storyteller may imagine a face that was not conventionally handsome but possessed an indefinable charm and unmistakable genius. Akechi's hair, however, was longer and hung in a tangled mass. Even while talking, he habitually raked his fingers through it, as if intent on making it still more disordered. He cared nothing for clothes and generally wore a cotton kimono with a limp, wrinkled sash.
"I am glad you came," he said. "We have not seen each other for several days. What do you make of the D Hill case? The police still seem to have no idea who the murderer is."
As he spoke, Akechi scratched his hair in his customary fashion and searched my face with his eyes. "As a matter of fact, I came because I have something to tell you about that." Unsure how to broach the subject, I began cautiously. "I have given the case a great deal of thought. More than that, I have made inquiries on the spot, as a detective would. I have now reached a conclusion, and I thought I should report it to you."
"Indeed? That is splendid. I should very much like to hear the details."
In his expression I detected contempt mingled with relief, as though he thought I could not possibly have discovered anything. The look stiffened my wavering resolve, and I launched into my account. One of my friends is a newspaper reporter. He is close to Detective Kobayashi, who is handling the case, so through him I have learned a great deal about the police investigation. They do not appear to have any coherent line of inquiry. They are active enough, of course, but have found nothing promising. You remember the light switch? That yielded nothing. Your prints were the only ones on it. The police believe your fingerprints probably covered the murderers. Once I learned how completely they were baffled, I became even more determined to investigate for myself. What do you suppose my conclusion is? And why do you think I came to tell you before taking it to the police? Let me begin elsewhere. From the day of the murder, one matter had troubled me. You remember the wholly contradictory statements made by the two students about the color of the man's clothing. One said black and the other white. Human eyesight may be unreliable, but is it not strange to confuse two absolute opposites? I do not know how the police interpreted it, but I believe both statements were accurate. Do you see? The culprit was wearing a garment banded in black and white, perhaps a yukata with broad black stripes, like the ones inns lend their guests. Why, then, did one student see pure white and the other pure black? Because they looked through the lattice of the shoji. At that instant, one student's eye occupied a position where a gap in the lattice aligned with a white part of the garment, while the other student's eye aligned with a black part. It may have been a rare coincidence, but it is not impossible, and no other explanation fits the circumstances. Now we know the stripe pattern of the murderer's clothing, but that alone merely narrows the field and proves nothing definite. My second ground is the fingerprint on the light switch. Through my reporter friend, I persuaded Detective Kobayashi to let me examine it, your fingerprint, that is. The result confirmed that my idea was correct. But tell me, do you have an inkstone I could borrow? I then demonstrated an experiment. After borrowing an inkstone, I lightly inked my right thumb and pressed it onto a sheet of thin Japanese writing paper I had brought with me, leaving a single print. I waited for it to dry, inked the same thumb again, turned it in a different direction, and pressed firmly over the first impression. Two distinct patterns appeared, crossing each other plainly. The police suppose your print lay over the murderers and erased it. As this experiment shows, that is impossible. However firmly a finger is pressed, a fingerprint consists of lines, and traces of the earlier print must remain in the spaces between the later lines. If the two prints came from the same finger and were placed in precisely the same position, every ridge might coincide and the later print might conceal the earlier one. That can scarcely occur, but even if it did, the conclusion in this case would not change. If the murderer turned off the light, his print had to remain on the switch. I wondered whether the police had overlooked an earlier pattern between the ridges of yours, so I examined it myself. There was no trace of another. In other words, the only prints ever placed on that switch were yours. I cannot explain why none belonging to the bookseller or his wife remained. Perhaps they always left the light on and never used the switch. What do these facts tell us? This is my reconstruction. A man wearing a yukata with broad, bold stripes attacked the bookseller's wife while her husband was away at his night stall. The man was probably a childhood friend of the dead woman, and an old disappointment in love would provide a possible motive. Since she neither cried out nor visibly resisted, she must have known him well. After accomplishing his purpose, he turned off the light and left, hoping to delay discovery of the body. His one fatal mistake was failing to notice that the shoji lattice stood open. When he hastily closed it, the two students at the storefront happened to see him. He went outside, but then realized that he must have left a fingerprint on the switch. It had to be removed. Entering the room a second time by the same method would be dangerous, so he conceived an ingenious plan. He would become the discoverer of the murder. Then he could turn the light on with perfect naturalness, removing any suspicion raised by his earlier print. Moreover, no one would imagine that the man who discovered the body was the murderer. The device offered two advantages. He calmly watched the police at work and even gave evidence with extraordinary boldness. Everything happened exactly as he intended. 5 days passed, then 10, and still no one came to arrest him. What expression did Kogoro Akechi wear as he listened? I expected some change to cross his face midway through the story, or at least that he would interrupt. To my astonishment, no change appeared. He was habitually reserved, but this composure was excessive. He merely continued raking his tangled hair in silence. Wondering how far his shamelessness could go, I advanced to my final point. You will certainly ask how the murderer entered and escaped. Unless that question is answered, all the other discoveries are worthless. Unfortunately for you, I found the answer as well. The search that night appeared to prove that no one had left. But since a murder occurred, the murderer must have entered and departed. There must have been a gap in the detective's search. The police seem to have labored over that problem. Regrettably, they were surpassed by an obscure student, myself. The truth is almost trivial. I reasoned that, after so thorough a police investigation, none of the neighbors was likely to be under suspicion. If so, perhaps the killer passed before people's eyes without being recognized for what he was. Witnesses may have observed him and dismissed the sight as irrelevant. He could have exploited a blind spot in human attention, for attention has blind spots just as vision does, and hidden himself as a conjurer hides a large object before the very eyes of his audience. The place I then noticed was Asahiya, the noodle shop 2 doors from the bookshop. To the right of the bookshop stood the watchmaker and then the confectioner, to the left stood the tabi shop and then the noodle shop. I went there and asked whether any man had asked to use their privy at about 8 on the night of the crime. You know Asahiya. The earthen passage continues from the shop to the back gate, with the privy immediately beside it. A man pretending to ask to use the privy could easily slip out through that gate and later return. The ice cream seller had his stall at the corner where the alley opened, so he would see nothing. And because Asahiya is a noodle shop, asking to use the privy would seem perfectly natural. The proprietor's wife was away that evening, and the proprietor alone sat in the shop, which made the circumstances ideal. What do you think? Is that not an inspired idea? And sure enough, a customer had asked to use the privy at precisely that time. Unfortunately, Asahiya's proprietor remembered nothing of the man's face, figure, or the pattern of his clothes. I immediately sent this information to Detective Kobayashi through my reporter friend. The detective seems to have questioned the noodle seller himself, but learned nothing more. I paused to give Akechi a chance to speak. In his position, surely he could not remain silent. Yet he continued calmly scratching his head. Until then, out of respect, I had spoken indirectly. Now I was forced to be direct. Akechi, you understand what I mean. Irrefutable evidence points to you. I confess that in my heart I still find it impossible to suspect you, but with so many facts aligned, I have little choice. I took considerable trouble to discover whether anyone in that row of houses owned a yukata with broad stripes. No one did. That is understandable. Even among striped yukata, few men would wear one so bold that its bands matched the shoji lattice. The fingerprint trick and the trick of asking to use the privy are both extremely ingenious, feats that could hardly be imitated by anyone but a student of crime such as you. Most suspicious of all, although you had told me the dead woman was your childhood friend, you stood listening that night while they investigated her identity and never said a word about knowing her. The only remaining hope would be an alibi, and that fails as well. Do you remember that on our way home I asked where you had been before coming to Hakubeikan? You said you had spent about an hour walking around the neighborhood. Even if someone saw you on your walk, a pedestrian might easily stop at a noodle shop to ask to use the privy. Akechi, am I wrong? If you can answer me, let us hear your defense. Dear reader, what do you suppose the eccentric Kogoro Akechi did when I pressed him in this fashion? Do you imagine he bowed his head in shame? Far from it. His response crushed my confidence in a wholly unexpected way. He suddenly burst into loud laughter.
Forgive me, forgive me. I did not mean to laugh, but you are so terribly serious, Akechi said apologetically. Your theory is quite interesting. I am delighted to have found a friend like you. Unfortunately, your reasoning is much too focused on outward appearances and physical evidence. Take my relationship with the woman. Did you examine, from a psychological point of view, what our relationship in childhood had actually been? Was I once in love with her? Did I resent her now? Could you not have inferred at least that much? The reason I did not mention knowing her that night is simple. I knew nothing that would have helped the inquiry. We parted before either of us had entered primary school. It is true that I discovered the connection by chance recently and spoke with her 2 or 3 times.
Then how, for example, do you explain the fingerprint?
Do you suppose I have been idle since the murder? I have done a good deal myself. I prowled D Hill almost every day, and often visited the bookshop. I drew the proprietor into conversation and questioned him in various ways. I told him then that I had known his wife, and the admission actually proved useful. Just as you learned about the police through your reporter, I learned from the bookseller. I soon heard about the fingerprint and investigated because it puzzled me. He gave a short laugh. The answer is almost comic. The bulb's filament had broken. No one turned the light off at all. We assumed flipping the switch had relit it, but in my haste I jostled the lamp, causing the broken ends of the tungsten filament to touch again. Naturally, only my prints were on the switch. You said that you saw the light burning through the shoji that evening. If so, the filament broke afterward. An old bulb can fail by itself without anyone touching it. As for the color of the murderer's clothing, rather than explain it myself.
He began excavating here and there among the piles of books and presently unearthed an old foreign volume.
Have you read this? It is Münsterberg's Psychology and Crime. Read the first 10 lines or so of the chapter called Illusions.
As I listened to his confident argument, I had begun to sense my own failure. I took the book as directed and read. The passage said substantially this. There was once a criminal case involving an automobile. In court, one sworn witness insisted that the road in question had been entirely dry and dusty, while another swore that recent rain had left it muddy. One said the automobile had been moving slowly, the other declared that he had never seen a car travel so fast. The former reported that only 2 or 3 people had been on the village road, while the latter described a crowd of men, women, and children. Both witnesses were respectable gentlemen who could gain nothing by distorting the facts. When I finished, Akechi turned several more pages and continued.
That was a real occurrence. Now look at the chapter entitled The Memory of the Witness. Near the middle is an account of a planned experiment. It happens to concern the color of clothing. I know it is a nuisance, but please read it.
The account ran as follows. Earlier passage omitted. To give one example, 2 years ago, this book was published in 1911. An academic meeting of jurists, psychologists, and physicists was held in Göttingen. All those assembled were therefore trained in exact observation. A carnival happened to be taking place in the town. In the middle of the scholarly meeting, the door suddenly flew open and a clown in gaudy costume rushed in like a madman. Behind him came a black man with a pistol in his hand. In the center of the hall they exchanged furious words. The clown collapsed to the floor, the other man sprang upon him, a pistol cracked. At once both men vanished from the room. The entire incident lasted less than 20 seconds. Naturally, the audience was greatly startled. Except for the chairman, no one realized that the words and movements had been rehearsed or that the scene had been photographed. It therefore seemed perfectly natural when the chairman asked each member to prepare an exact account, explaining that the matter might be brought before a court. The omitted passage gives percentages showing how thoroughly their accounts were mistaken. Of 40 observers, only 4 correctly stated that the black man wore nothing on his head. Some of the others described a bowler, and some a silk hat. His clothing was called red, brown, striped, coffee-colored, and various other shades. In fact, he wore white trousers, a black jacket, and a large red necktie. Later passage omitted.
As Münsterberg so wisely demonstrated, Akechi began, human observation and memory are profoundly unreliable. Even the scholars in that example could not agree on the color of a man's clothes. Is it unreasonable for me to think the students that night were mistaken? They may indeed have seen someone, but that person could not have been wearing anything with broad stripes, and certainly was not me. Your idea that the shoji lattice produced the striped yukata is clever, but is it not a little too convenient? Rather than believe such a remarkable coincidence, could you not at least believe in my innocence? Finally, there is the man who supposedly asked to use the noodle shop's privy. At first I reasoned exactly as you did. Asahiya seemed the only possible route of escape, so I too went there to investigate. Regrettably, I reached a conclusion precisely opposite to yours. In fact, no man asked to use the privy that night.
The reader has probably seen the difficulty already. By denying the witness's statements, the murderer's fingerprint, and even the murderer's route of escape, Akechi was trying to prove his own innocence. But was he not at the same time denying that the crime itself had occurred? I had no idea what he meant. Then do you know who the murderer is?
I do. He tousled his hair as he answered. My method differs somewhat from yours. Physical evidence can mean almost anything, depending on how it is interpreted. The best method of detection is to look into the deepest recesses of the human mind, though that naturally depends upon the detective's own abilities. At any rate, that is the approach I emphasized in this case.
The first thing to attract my attention was the many fresh injuries on the bookseller's wife. Soon afterward, I learned that the noodle seller's wife bore similar marks, as you already know. Yet neither husband seemed brutal. Both the bookseller and the noodle seller appeared mild and reasonable. I could not help suspecting that some secret lay beneath the facts. I first approached the bookseller and tried to draw the secret out of him. Because I had known his dead wife, he trusted me to some extent, and the task was comparatively easy. I learned something very strange. Asahiya's proprietor was more difficult. Despite appearances, he is a strong-willed man, and it took considerable effort to probe him. But by a certain method, I succeeded. You know that the psychological association test has begun to be used in criminal investigation. A suspect is given a series of simple stimulus words, and the speed of his mental associations is measured. But I do not believe the stimuli must always be simple words such as dog, house, or river, as the psychologists prescribe, nor that one always needs a chronoscope. Once a person understands the principle of association testing, such formalities are not very important. Long before modern psychology developed, celebrated judges and detectives used this psychological method unknowingly, guided only by natural insight. Lord Uka was surely one of them. In fiction, at the beginning of Poe's Rue Morgue, Dupin infers what his companion is thinking from a single bodily movement. Doyle imitates it in The Resident Patient, where Holmes performs similar reasoning. All of these are association tests in a broad sense. The mechanical methods devised by psychologists merely assist ordinary people who lack such intuitive perception. But I have wandered from the point. In that broader sense, I administered a kind of association test to the noodle seller. I engaged him in various conversations, nothing more than trivial small talk, and observed his psychological responses. The process is subtle and rather complicated, so I shall explain the details another time. The result, however, convinced me that I had found the murderer.
There is not a single piece of physical evidence. I therefore cannot denounce him to the police, and if I did, they would probably refuse to act. There is another reason I know the murderer yet remain idle. This crime involved no malice. It sounds strange, but this murder was carried out by mutual consent between killer and victim. It may even have occurred at the victim's own desire.
I tried every conjecture I could think of, but could not understand him. Forgetting my embarrassment over my own failure, I listened intently to this extraordinary reasoning. The murderer, in my opinion, is the proprietor of Asahiya. He invented the story of the man who had asked to use the privy in order to cover the traces of his crime. But he did not invent it entirely on his own. We were at fault. You and I each framed our question by asking whether such a man had appeared. It was almost as though we prompted him. He also mistook us for detectives. Why, then, did he commit murder? This case has shown me vividly what unexpected and sinister secrets can hide behind the most ordinary surface of life. It was the kind of secret one expects to encounter only in nightmares.
The proprietor of Asahiya was a sadist in the tradition of the Marquis de Sade, and by a grotesque turn of fate he discovered, 2 doors away, a woman who was his masochistic counterpart. The bookseller's wife was as strongly drawn to suffering as he was to inflicting it. With the ingenuity peculiar to people guarding such a secret, they conducted their affair without being discovered. Now you understand what I meant by a consensual murder. Until recently, each had barely satisfied those desires through their respective spouses. The similar fresh injuries on the bookseller's wife and the wife of Asahiya were evidence of it. Naturally, neither was content. When they found, almost next door, precisely the partner each had been seeking, one can readily imagine how quickly they came to an understanding. But fate carried its cruel joke too far. The combination of his active impulse and her passive one drove their frenzy steadily to greater extremes. On that night, it finally brought about an event that neither of them had intended.
I shuddered involuntarily at Akechi's extraordinary conclusion. What a case it was! Just then the tobacconist's wife brought up the evening paper. Akechi took it and examined the news pages. Presently he sighed softly.
Ah! It appears he could bear it no longer. He has surrendered to the police. What a strange coincidence that this report should reach us just as we are discussing the matter.
I looked where he pointed. Beneath a small headline, in an item of about 10 lines, was the news that the noodle shop proprietor had surrendered.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.